morning, then we're going to open up the floor for any questions or discussion points that people would like to raise. A couple of announcements before we kick off. We've got a petition circulating to kick Veolia off our campuses. It's all detailed on the petition. Do have a read of that. We're going to pass it around, please sign. We're also going to be passing around a pad of paper for solidarity messages to the SOAS occupation. I don't know if any of you have seen about it, but the School of Oriental African Studies went into occupation in solidarity with Gaza yesterday evening. Fran Legg's joining us from SOAS, which will be speaking this evening. So that's going around if you've got any messages of solidarity you'd like to offer. So I'm going to hand over to the speakers now. We're starting with Kate Connolly from Queen Mary Stop the War, and she's going to be talking about the history of Gaza.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I want to start off by saying that it's a universal truth that repressive states all around the world tell lies about themselves. But the lies that are told by and about the Israeli state are lies that are repeated in the mainstream media, they are repeated by politicians across the world. And I think that's why it's very, very important to challenge those lies. And to do so, I think it's very important to look at the history of the state of Israel and of the oppression of the Palestinians. And I want to talk about the first lie that I want to talk about is the idea that the great imperial powers in the world support the state of Israel out of a sense of a hatred of oppression and out of the goodness of their hearts. Now, the state of Israel was born out of oppression, but not in the way that it's usually presented, I would argue, in the mainstream media. In the 19th century, there was massive persecution against the Jews across Europe. And a small minority within the Jewish community, the Zionists, argued that the way out of this problem was to create a homeland for the Jews. But the problem was that in order to do this, they realised they would have to rely upon one of the great powers, at least one of the great powers, backing them in this project. And in 1917, somebody stepped forward to do this, and that was Arthur Balfour in this country. And he signed in 1917 the Balfour Declaration, which opened the way for much, much larger Jewish settlements in Palestine. Now, Lord Arthur Balfour was no friend of the Jews. In fact, Lord Arthur Balfour was a disgusting little anti-Semite. Lord Arthur Balfour was Prime Minister in 1905, which is when the Aliens Act was passed in this country. And that was specifically to restrict immigration, particularly into this part of London, actually. Specifically to attack Jewish immigration. The people that were fleeing the pogroms in Poland and in Russia were coming to this country, and he didn't even want them here. And that is why the Aliens Act was passed. In the very same year, 1917, that he signed the Balfour Declaration with the Zionists, what was going on in East London should have shown that this man was no friend to the Jews. All round these streets in 1917, there was state-sponsored massive violence against the Jews. It was in the middle of the First World War, and the government encouraged the police to go out and drag Jewish men of all ages, children and old men, out of restaurants, out of clubs, beat them up in the street, take them, imprison them, interrogate them about why they weren't doing military service. It was an absolutely disgusting period of history, and that was what was going on in the very same year. And essentially, people like Lord Arthur Balfour, who were very happy to sign this declaration, very happy to sign up for the idea for a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, were doing this because they didn't want the Jews in Europe. They didn't want them in this country. They didn't want them making a fuss in East London. They wanted them out of the way. And that's the kind of anti-Semitism that drove the project from the start. Now, obviously, after the horrors of the Holocaust, there was a much greater resonance for the idea of an Israeli state, precisely because of what had happened in Europe and the awfulness of that. But it was the same governments who backed the creation of the State of Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust, who were the same governments who shut their own doors against the Jewish immigrants who were trying to flee the Holocaust. I come from a town called Harwich, which isn't famous for particularly very much at all. But one of it's a port town in Essex, and one of the few things that it is famous for, actually, was that just before the Second World War broke out, people in this country lobbied, trade unionists, socialists, liberals, Quakers, pacifists, these kind of people, lobbied the British government to say at least allow some Jewish children from across Europe to come into this country. And it was through Harwich that they came, and it's called the Kindertransport. Almost all of those Jewish children who arrived in this country were orphans within a few years because their parents were not able to join them because of the racist immigration policy of this country. And, you know, it was this state that backed the creation of the State of Israel. So I want to put to bed this idea that the great powers helped the creation of the State of Israel out of any sympathy for the Jewish people or out of any anger for oppression. The second lie that I want to come to was a myth that was put about that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. And that was the phrase that was regularly used about why the State of Israel should be put into Palestine. And when, after the Second World War, the UN participated in the creation of the State of Israel, at that time, the Jewish population in Palestine owned about 6% of the land. The UN granted them 56%, which meant the absolutely massive displacement of Palestinian people. And still that was not enough. In fact, the early Israeli state used a massive wave of violence. The book to read about this is Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, if people want to read about what happened in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel. And huge violence, shooting, bombing, terror was used to evict Palestinians from their homes and to grab even more than that initial 56%. One of the most infamous massacres was the massacre of Deir Yassin, in which 90 people were killed, a third of whom were babies. So this was a state that was founded on terrorism, on war, on displacement and on oppression. There were 850,000 refugees created by the violence in the wake of the start of the creation of Israel. And even the UN passed a resolution to say that Israel ought to allow the refugees returning. And that resolution, like so many others, was just completely ignored by Israel. In fact, Israel has broken more UN resolutions than any other country across the region. So why is this the case? Well, this is the case because the creation of Israel depended crucially upon it serving the interests of the great powers. And this was known absolutely from the start. I've got a quote here from one of the main Israeli papers, Haaretz, from 1951. And this is what was written. Israel is to become the watchdog. If for any reasons the Western powers should sometimes wish to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighbouring states. And punish the neighbouring states is exactly what Israel set about doing. In 1956, when the president of Egypt, Nasser, nationalised the Suez Canal, which obviously annoyed the people who thought they ought to own it, like Britain and France, Israel fought along the British and fought alongside the British and the French forces to stop that from happening. In 1967, it started another war to take even more territory, and we've seen Israel play this kind of policing role across the Middle East ever since then. You know, you think back to events like Lebanon in 2006, and you think about the kind of rhetoric that the Israeli state comes out with about Iran today. Yeah. And it is only able to do this because it is the biggest recipient of US military aid. It is also the biggest recipient of US civilian aid. And it is also, of course, the only country in the region that has nuclear weapons. But it doesn't just rely upon force to maintain the status quo in the Middle East. In fact, typically the history that I'm talking about has also relied upon the bribery of other states in the region to cooperate with Israel. And so to cooperate with Israel, to not rock the boat, some of the most corrupt leaders in the region, so people like Hosni Mubarak, when he was in power in Egypt, were given military aid by America as a thank you for keeping peace with Israel and having a peace treaty and not making a fuss about the Palestinians. It was also a very nice reward to suppress their own people and stop them from rising up. Now, of course, the Palestinians, without a state, haven't been able to compromise in this way. There's been no leaders that have been able to no sort of give and take, if you like, that's been able to be constructed. And so the plight of the Palestinians, the plight of the Palestinian refugees across the region, the resistance of the Palestinians has been a living reminder of the betrayal of the leaders across the Middle East who completely sold down the Palestinian cause out and were quite happy to receive aid for sort of keeping the peace in the region and not rocking the boat, not criticise anything at all. And it was that reminder that the Palestinian population stood for. It is the reason that you've seen some of the most sort of corrupt and appalling leaders in the Middle East attack even the Palestinian refugees. And so in 1982, the Israeli forces stood by. The Israeli forces, by the way, commanded by Ariel Sharon, the later Prime Minister of Israel, stood aside as the extreme right-wing movements in Lebanon went into the refugee camps and killed thousands of people in the refugee camps, Shabra and Shatila. And you see again the way this has played out more recently with Mubarak's refusal to open the Rafah crossing during the Qas-led operation in Israel. But in the same way that the Palestinian plight of the Palestinians represents the betrayal of some of the most corrupt leaders, some of whom, of course, have been overthrown in the Arab Spring recently. For people across the Middle East, the Palestinian causes represents their hopes. It represents a common struggle against their oppressors, their leaders, who have not only sold out the Palestinians, but are repressing people in their own countries. And that's why the Palestinian cause has given so much inspiration to people. And I think especially since 2001, when Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, tried to interpret or reinterpret, sell to the world that the oppression of the Palestinians and justify more and more attacks on the Palestinians by trying to sort of weave this into the war on terror that George Bush was waging in the Middle East. That actually the global resistance movement to war that sparked off across the world meant that global resistance movement also took up the cause of Palestine in a very, very serious way, and that the resistance of the Palestinians, their courageous struggle, inspired people across the world because they saw them as the constant victims of imperialism and colonialism. And I want to just finish on those kind of protest movements, because Palestine has always inspired people who've wanted to resist, who've understood the injustice there and related it to their own lives. And what I want to say today really is that protest around these issues absolutely works. If you think back to Qas-led and what happened then when the Israeli state bombed Gaza 4 years ago, it was absolutely dreadful. You saw it on their television screens, and you saw the way the BBC reported it, then as now, completely biased, talking about, oh, well, yeah, maybe Hamas have got to bear some of the responsibility, really not talking about where the major violence is, saying, oh, these are kind of two equal sides, when it's manifestly not a question of that. You saw the same bias from the politicians in the world who were, quite happy to cozy up to Israel, as usual, always blaming the Palestinians. It was absolutely outrageous. But what you also saw at the same time was people occupy their universities. There was a huge wave of occupations in this country. There were huge protest movements. There was massive angry demonstrations outside the Israeli embassy. And this created a completely new climate, this kind of protest. And in fact, you had the Israeli state warning its high command in the army that they shouldn't be getting on planes, they should not be going abroad just in case they got arrested. Now, they weren't doing that because they thought that the Prime Minister of this country, or the Prime Minister of France, or the Prime Minister of any other country in Europe, or the President of the United States was going to arrest them. But what they were terrified by was the fact that what they were doing had been seen by the world. People could see the truth about what they were doing, and that's why there was that fear about going abroad. We need to isolate this state. I think we should call for the same kind of protests this time round.
I'm going to hand you over now to Sam Player from Queen Mary Palestine Solidarity Society, and then he's going to speak on Queen Mary Council, and he's going to talk about the blockade on Gaza.
Thanks, Evan. I'm going to talk about the everyday situation in Gaza. So it's been under a blockade since 2006. I'm going to tell you about the details of that. This is what happens when there's no fighting. Gaza isn't on the news. But it carries on every day, and that has done for more than 5 years. So on the wall behind me, I've got a couple of maps. This is Palestine, including Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, down here in the corner, is only 2% of the area of historic Palestine. Here it is zoomed in on the Gaza Strip. That contains 1.7 million people, and 350 square kilometres, and more than 2/3 of them are refugees. And the first point I want to stress about the blockade is that they're closed in on every side. So 2 sides of the Gaza Strip are land borders with Israel, and they're completely closed off. And Israel maintains a 300-metre, or sometimes more. They say they keep a 300-metre buffer zone, as they call it. And anyone who goes into that buffer zone, Israel tells them that they're going to be shot. And in fact, sometimes they shoot people a lot further away, up to a kilometre. That's happened to a couple of farmers this year who've been shot in the buffer zone. Obviously, that's completely illegal under international law, but it's part of the Gaza Strip, and these farmers have land there, and they have the right to go and farm. One side of the Gaza Strip is the Mediterranean Sea. Under the last treaty, which was signed between the PLO and Israel in 1993, the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians are allowed to go 25 miles out into the sea to fish. And what happens to them now is that if they go any further than 3 miles from the shore, they're shot at by the Israeli Navy. There are lots of videos you can watch of this. First of all, the boats drive past them very fast and cause the boat to rock so they can't fish. And then they start firing machine guns until the fishermen have to turn around and go home. And fishing is one of the main industries and one of the main ways by which the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip can feed themselves. So that's massively disruptive for their lives. The last border, the last side of the four sides is between the Gaza Strip and Israel and Egypt. There's one crossing called the Rafah crossing. When the blockade first started, Egypt was controlled by Mubarak, and Rafah was completely shut, apart from a very small number of special cases. But for all intents and purposes, it was closed. A few months after Mubarak fell, the Rafah crossing was open somewhat, but it still wasn't open in the sense that we think of a border being open. It would only let through a few hundred people a day, and they had to get permits in advance. And a few months ago, I'm not sure when, they closed it again. The current situation is that the Rafah border is completely closed. That's continued even while Israel is bombing the Gaza Strip. Anyone who wants to leave can't, they're stuck. The only people who can get through Rafah at the moment are a few people who are seriously injured and they need treatment. They're the only people who've been allowed to go to the Rafah border. The next point I want to talk about is food restrictions. So, starting in 2007, so this is a government advisor of Israel said that the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. So all food shipments to the Gaza Strip have to come through, sorry to all the people behind the column by the way, I'm just pointing at a map. All the food shipments have to come through borders which are controlled by Israel, which means Israel can completely control what goes in and out of the Gaza Strip, even though there's a border with Rafah, with Egypt. As part of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, no goods are allowed to go from Egypt into Gaza. All goods have to go through Israel. The Israeli government wanted to put the Palestinians on a diet, not make them die of hunger. And the document was released a few months ago, showing that they had counted the exact number of calories which each person in the Gaza Strip needed, and they let them have exactly that amount of food, and nothing more, like they're watering plants or something. And they banned a large number of types of food for a few years. These restrictions got largely lifted in 2010 after the huge global protests against the attack on the Gaza flotilla. But they originally banned for a few years lentils, pasta, tomato paste, juice, crisps, cookies, dried food, hummus, and coriander. And there's a huge list of other things, but those are just a few of them which are illustrative. So they weren't just banning completely extravagant luxuries, they were banning lentils, which are a staple food. That was lifted in 2010, as I said, following massive worldwide protests following the Gaza flotilla. And now they still restrict the food that's going in. There's a lot less than the Gaza Strip needs, but it's better than it was then. And that shows that protest is important and it works. The water situation in the Gaza Strip. So, Palestinians in Gaza get all of their water from an underground reservoir, which is being depleted at a very fast rate. And the World Health Organization says that by 2020, the Gaza Strip is going to be unlivable if nothing changes. People won't be able to survive there. As it is, 90% of the water in the Gaza Strip is considered not fit for human consumption by the World Health Organization. And people have to drink it because people have to drink water and there's no other water. So they have to drink water which is not considered fit for human consumption. Restrictions on everyday goods. So absolutely no exports are allowed out of the Gaza Strip, considering how small it is. So that means it has to fund, that means it has to sustain itself as a self-sufficient economy, which is impossible for such a small piece of territory. They're not allowed to export anything, and things that they're not allowed to import include a completely ridiculous list. So this is what Israel claims is for its security. The Palestinians aren't allowed to bring these things in. A4 paper, crayons, stationery, soccer balls, books, candles. I think candles is a particularly distasteful one. I'll tell you in a minute about the power cuts that they have. They ban clothing, cups, blankets, shoes, mattresses. There's a whole list of other things. They also ban reconstruction materials, which I think is horrific, especially in light of the fact that in the Gaza war 4 years ago, 4,000 homes were destroyed, and they were not allowed to have any building materials. So they banned cement, glass, steel, wood, doors, and there's a long list of other building materials which are banned. And by the way, the restrictions on the Gaza Strip have completely laid waste to the economy. There's 45% unemployment. The next thing I'm going to talk about is power cuts. So since 2006, there have been daily power cuts of about 8 hours. There are periods when they last for less amount of time. There are periods when they last longer. It's about 8 hours. You know what it's like trying to live in a modern world, and you think of, imagine that nothing which uses electricity works for 8 hours a day, and you don't know when that's going to happen. You might be in the middle of writing an essay, and suddenly all the lights turn off, your computer turns on, and you have no control over it. That's partially because they can't get fuel in for all the power plants. There used to be a lot more power plants. Some of them were bombed by Israel in Operation Castle in 2008, the Gaza massacre. So another thing I want to mention, which is very important to Palestinians, is the separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So the occupied Palestinian territories, as they're designated together in international law, there's two of them. There's the West Bank and there's the Gaza Strip. In 2005, well, since 1967, both of them have been under military occupation by Israel, which means Israeli soldiers, checkpoints, everyone's jeeps driving up and down everything, people get shot all the time, it's horrible. In 2005, Israel moved its soldiers and moved its illegal settlements out of the Gaza Strip. But because they've closed off the Gaza Strip, they've stopped all the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, of which there are 1.7 million, from travelling to the West Bank. That means they can't go to university there. The oldest university in Palestine is in the West Bank. Students from Gaza used to go there, and now they're not able to. Obviously, a lot of them have families who live in the West Bank, and they can't visit their families. And there are a lot of people who haven't seen their cousins for over 10 years at least, and for no reason other than they're physically not allowed there. And the West Bank is still occupied in every sense. You still have soldiers everywhere, checkpoints everywhere. And if someone from Gaza tried to go and visit someone who lived in the West Bank, they wouldn't have any chance. One story I think illustrates this fact is a woman who's an activist, and she makes some YouTube videos. She's born in, or she lived the early part of her life in Wales, she's a Palestinian woman, and then travelled back to the West Bank with her parents, and and they lived together, and then suddenly Israeli soldiers noticed that her father had an identity card which didn't say West Bank, it said Gaza Strip. So they just deported him overnight to the Gaza Strip, and his family got separated in an instant, just like that. One important point, I think, which so people often see Israel fighting with Gaza Strip, and it's like these two separate countries fighting. But the occupation really still is going on. One point that illustrates that is that there's about 445 prisoners from the Gaza Strip who are currently in Israel. So when it's convenient for Israel, they'll treat Gaza Strip like it's part of it, and they can just put people in prison. And they also stop the families from visiting ever since the blockade has come into force. And something which really shocks me is the fact that every single person who lives in Gaza has got an Israeli-issued ID card written in Hebrew. So when you watch, you get used to the idea of thinking kind of that these are two countries fighting, and you think that one of these sides has their ID cards issued by the other side. It's a piece of trivia, but for me that sort of highlights the absurdity of the situation. And the last thing I want to talk about is the harassment and psychological damage that's being done to the population of Gaza. So almost every night they have drones flying around, unmanned aerial vehicles. They're called zananas in Arabic by the Palestinians, which means whining child, because of the sound they make. They just make a constant sound. And it's so loud because of how low they're flying that people find it hard to sleep while they're there. And they just, they give people a feeling of constantly being harassed. They can't stop thinking about the occupation, even when they're trying to sleep. All they can think about is these loud Israeli drones that are flying overhead. And this isn't when there's a war going on. It's an everyday situation. Some horrible statistics. So 83% of people who live in the Gaza Strip have seen someone be shot. 62% of people who live in the Gaza Strip have had a family member killed. Someone went to the Gaza Strip in 2006, which was before Operation Cast Lead, and they examined the mental state of some of the children who lived there. And they found that 69% of them had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. In this country, when you think about post-traumatic stress disorder, you think about soldiers who've chosen to join the army, go away to another country and fight. These are just children who have done nothing other than be born in this country, and they are suffering symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which include nightmares about the things they've seen, debilitating flashbacks, and terrifying memories. That was before Operation Cast Lead. After Operation Cast Lead, another group went and did the same study, and they now found that 91% of children in the Gaza Strip have got symptoms of moderate to severe, the language they use, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I just want to stress again that that's the everyday reality in the Gaza Strip. I'm not talking about the escalation which is going on at the moment. I'm not talking about Operation Cast Lead. You might have seen that they're talking about a ceasefire which will start tonight. If that ceasefire is a thing which happens, this will be the reality that they go back to. It won't go away when there's a ceasefire. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much. That was a really informative speech there. I'm now going to hand you over to Tarek, who is the Palestine Solidarity Society president, and he's going to talk about conflict and resistance in the region.
So I'm going to be talking about the wars that happen. Well, they call wars, but it's actually more genocide than anything. Because saying wars is kind of saying that both sides are equal when they are not equal. I think most of you know about Operation Cast Lead. This was about 4 years ago. It started on the 27th of December when Israel decided to attack police stations all over Gaza. This lasted about 3 hours. It resulted in the death of more than 200 people. and about 350 were injured, of whom 120 were critically injured. Now, I know it's become so difficult to comprehend these numbers because the media here has kind of portrayed them as just numbers, but we need to think of it as more than that. It's just, each one is a life, right? It's become really difficult to understand that. So 200, 300, it's just become a number. So when you think of this, I just want you to think of it as each one is basically your life. Your life has basically ended for them. This is what's happening. The time the attacks happened when schools were ending. So a lot of children were going home, and a lot of children were killed that day. The Palestinians are sick and tired of the siege, are sick and tired of the water being not clean, sick and tired of medical supplies to be scarce, sick and tired of not being able to leave an area which is only 350 kilometers squared. Imagine being stuck in an area in London, just stuck in London. You can't leave, you can't do anything, you can't go on holiday, you can't do anything, just staying in one place. So they are sick and tired of this. So they asked their elected government to retaliate. Okay, they basically asked them to stop attacking us, because if you just stay quiet, they are just going to get killed. So Hamas went and retaliates by firing homemade weapons. This causes Israel to escalate the situation and they did an invasion into basically a ground operation, and they have committed a horrendous amount of war crimes. I'm just going to name a few. Amnesty International have reported that Israel prevented ambulances and medical staff from attending the wounded. Now, if you see on YouTube, and if you were just to type ambulance being shot, Gaza, whatever, you would find that not just one video, you'd find 20, 30 videos of ambulances, rescue teams, people who are obviously there to help the wounded. Okay, so they are not allowing people to help the wounded. People who are obviously there to help the wounded, with all the Red Cross and so on, are being shot to stop them from getting to them. Now, also, Amnesty International have reported that Israelis have used civilians as human shields. Now, when they take a house, they go and basically use it as a military base. Okay, and they keep the people who own that house inside, so that people won't, like Hamas, won't come and attack them. So they're using them as human shield. This is obviously illegal under any type of international law. Some of the civilians were forced to carry out dangerous tasks like checking if the house is booby-trapped, if an object was obviously booby-trapped, and some of these were reported to be children as well. Now, I know you know about white phosphorus that was used in Gaza. If you don't know about white phosphorus, it is an illegal weapon that was used once in Vietnam. Well, it was used more than once in Vietnam, and since then it's been recognized as an internationally illegal weapon. Now, what happens when someone is hit by or touched by white phosphorus? It kind of literally just keeps on burning the bone, the flesh, and it keeps on going. The only way, well, it's really difficult to put it out, but one of the ways to stop it from getting to the vital body parts is to amputate limbs, which is quite a horrifying thing, but that's the truth in what's happening and what happened during that war, that genocide. And there's many, many other war crimes, but I'm not going to go through them all. But if you were to go on any website, you'd find them all. So what has the international community did about this horrible thing that's been happening there? Well, a UN report resulting from a 4-man mission that went there to check what's going on, the Goldstone report, if you know about it, have stated that the killing of civilians appears to have been the direct objective of the Israeli military. It also cites that war crimes and potential crimes against humanity are carried out by the Israeli army. So the report basically calls out to international governments to take those people who are responsible for this to the International Court of Justice. Obviously, Israel went and disputed this, they denied this, they made up a load of names, And then they made up their own independent report, which obviously, surprise, surprise, stated that their operation was legal. After that, nothing happened. Now, as if the massacre that happened in Karslet wasn't enough, more than 1,400 people killed, and so many more injured. As if that wasn't enough, supplies weren't allowed to enter Gaza. Now, supplies weren't allowed to enter Gaza. Basically, basic building materials like to rebuild mosques, schools, homes, they weren't allowed for months to enter Gaza. School supplies like basic paper for children to be able to write and to be able to educate it wasn't even allowed. So what happened is charities all over the world decided to confront this siege directly by sending a convoy of vessels. Now, I don't know if you heard of this, but Mavi Marmara was one of the most famous ones. It was sent from, well, basically from Turkey, but there was people from all over the world that were on it. And what happened is, about 3 a.m., now, okay, Mavi Marmara only had medical supplies and school supplies, and the Turkish government have checked this thoroughly. The Israelis went after they raided it. After they raided it, they found no weapons, nothing, but they just found school supplies and medical supplies, and a lot of people who were activists and trying to help, like teachers, doctors, and so on. So at 3 a.m., the Israeli Navy and IDF raided the ship, killing 9 activists who were of Turkish nationality. And then they abducted the crew and passengers. Before raiding the ship, Israel blocked all communications to this vessel. Now, this is not surprising, obviously, because they don't want people to see what's going on while they raid the ship, and they want to basically add their own propaganda to it. So all phones and video cameras, anything that had any recording device was confiscated, and anyone till now still didn't get their phones back or video cameras. Israel went and put a couple of videos up of their own, of what happened there. Obviously it's been edited extensively. A lot of media outlets have criticised it because, like, at some point it was quite obvious it was photoshopped. So international community has called this piracy because the vessel was in international waters. The International Court of Justice, and I'm going to quote this, vessels on the high seas are subject to no authority except that of the state whose flag they fly. No state may exercise any kind of jurisdiction over foreign vessels upon them. Israel completely ignored this. So because of what happened there, and there was a lot of international pressure on Israel to stop the siege in Gaza, Israel eases the siege slightly, only very slightly, just limited medical supplies were allowed in. Now the most recent outbreak that happened is called Pillar of the Cloud. I think a lot of people call it Pillar of Lies. What happened is a lot of people don't understand how it started. It didn't start from Hamas firing rockets. It didn't start from Ahmed al-Jabari from being assassinated. It actually started from a child, a 13-year-old Hamid Abu Defker, while he was playing football in a courtyard, to be shot in the head by an Israeli Apache and shot and killed. So Hamas retaliated with a few homemade rockets in response to that, because Palestinians believed that Israel was at it again. Israel then assassinates Ahmed al-Jabari. Ahmed al-Jabari is the lead military commander for Hamas. Now let's just put this into kind of a different perspective. Okay, say, and I'm sure this will never happen because Hamas hasn't got the power or anything. But say one of the leaders of Israel gets assassinated. Okay, I can assure you that Israel would wipe Gaza off the map. So why doesn't Hamas, a person who is politically and legally elected into government, Why can't they retaliate? Why do they expect them to just stay quiet? I don't understand that. So why is it also okay for four-year-old twins to get killed by accidental drones? Why is it okay for a family of 11 to be brutally murdered by an Israeli airstrike? Why is it okay for a woman pregnant with twins to be killed? Even as I speak, in the last 2 hours, a dozen Palestinians have been killed, of whom were two children. And here we are hearing about Israelis complaining about their pets having anxiety attacks because of sirens, okay? While Palestinians are being killed on the other side. I guess we know where the international priorities lie here. The world is going to continue to stand by while Israel claims it's acting in self-defense. We are here, basically, to help Palestinians live.
She's joining us from the SOAS occupation. I went to occupation yesterday evening, and Fran was a former student here at Queen Mary. She was heavily involved when Queen Mary went into occupation over Gaza.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. It's like been a really informative meeting, so thanks to you guys for putting it on. So just to provide a little background, as many of you may know, there was a wave of occupations in 2009 over Operation Condensed. At Queen Mary, we occupied FB 1.13 for 8 days. Our principal demands were that the university divest from weapons companies, because the university was basically investing in companies that were supplying Israel with weapons, that they sign up to a fully comprehensive ethical investment policy, that the university condemn the attacks on the Gaza Strip, that we send aid and equipment to students in Gaza, and that Palestinians be added to the list of people eligible to apply for scholarships, because at the time Palestinians were not recognised as a people and were not able to apply for scholarships at Queen Mary. Most of our demands were met. I'm very pleased to say that Queen Mary should now not be investing in weapons companies, although I hear that they are currently investing in Veolia. Palestinians have been added to the list of scholarships. A lot of aid was sent out. The university did release a statement, although predictably it was very kind of wishy-washy and basically condemned loss of life on both sides. It massively politicised Queen Mary. We had general meetings of 200, 300 people on a daily basis, people coming in to speak and have teach-outs and take part in debates, etc. So this time around, as some of you may have heard, SOAS went into occupation last night. We had a union general meeting. I'm now a master's student at SOAS. We had a union general meeting last night at which the union voted unanimously to support an occupation in solidarity with Gaza. Our principal demands are that the university condemn the attacks on Gaza and also critically condemn William Hague's statement, which I don't know if people have heard. He basically came out and said that loss of Palestinian life is entirely the fault of Hamas, basically. So you can't really expect much better from these people. But why occupy? The belief of students in 2009, and I think the belief of SOAS students at the moment is that we obviously in Britain, where we can most successfully apply pressure is to our British government. If you can force your, a major educational institution such as Queen Mary, such as SOAS, to come out, to challenge, to criticise, to be seen to criticise the government's position, it then applies pressure on Israel. Sorry, I'm very, very tired. Okay, so basically the key thing with occupation, I don't know how far the Palestinian Society has discussed potentially occupying or not. Obviously that's something that you guys have to discuss. But in terms of the logistics, I would recommend either going through a union general meeting, or if you don't feel that's possible, going in through the back of a public meeting, so that you can really have legitimacy, so that occupation has legitimacy, so that you're seen to have kind of broad-based support from the student body. When we went in 2009 in Queen Mary, we didn't feel that we would win it in the UGM. We went in following a big public meeting of about 300 people, and the feeling was such in the room that yes, we should occupy now. We had a rough idea of demands beforehand, but you'll find that they can kind of be finessed and discussed within the democratic processes of the occupation itself. The key thing is not to have an occupation for occupation's sake. I can't stress that enough, really. Because the whole thing is, it has to be a political intervention. Basically, you have to be doing it for political reasons. Yes, it's nice to have a liberated space in which people can come and share ideas and put on performances and have teach outs and film screenings and stuff. But the principal aim of the occupation, we at SOAS have felt, is to directly apply pressure on university management and to get them to condemn the British government's position on this. Also, it has to be within the wider context of obviously building this national demonstration on Saturday. We've got a demonstration, student demonstration tomorrow. We're hoping that the Palestine block on that is going to be massive, and kind of all part of putting Palestine back on the agenda of for Queen Mary for other universities. If you have any questions, do let me know. Sorry, that was probably a bit all over the shop, but and also if you guys can put messages of solidarity for the SOAS occupiers, that would be great. Everyone's quite fraught and tired at the moment, so any support that you can give would be really welcome.
Okay, we're going to move to our final speaker now. We're going to be looking at Palestine in the context of the global Palestine in a global context as well as the region. I'm Modi from Queen Mary Socialist Workers Student Society is going to talk about Palestine and the Arab revolt.
Thank you. Growing up in a really repressive regime in Saudi Arabia, my Yemeni mother used to always tell me the Arabs will be free once the Palestinians are free, and that's what I really wanted to talk about tonight. The biggest difference between the current attack on Gaza and the other one is that the regional furniture of the Middle East has had a dramatic change. Hamad Dabashi, an Iranian scholar, said, the Arab Spring is sort of a third Palestinian intifada, but enlarged. And this is what I wanted to go into. One of the two countries in which Israel has signed a peace treaty with, one has gone through a revolution and is bringing Islamicists to power, and the other, Jordan, is being rattled to the core through a mass uprising. In Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Emirates, and even in parts of Saudi Arabia, they're all being gripped by the same fever of uprising and revolution. On Friday, the Egyptian Prime Minister was sent to Gaza, and he called a rallying cry to help our Gazian brothers and sisters and to stop the bloodshed. In 2011, in September, hundreds stormed the Israeli embassy in Egypt, and they expelled the Israeli ambassador. Last week, this happened again. The Israeli ambassador was forced to leave due to the angry mob outside. On Sunday, with over 500 activists crossed into Gaza in a solidarity convoy. This was single-handedly the largest form of solidarity that Gaza has seen since 1967. Since the Arab Revolution occurred in Egypt, the gas line between Egypt and Gaza has been bombed 11 times, and a rather effective form of BDS, if I say so myself. It's resulted in the cancellation of the deal, and it has to be redrafted as well. There has literally been a tidal wave of anti-Israeli resentment, not only in the Arab Street, we've seen this globally everywhere. But before proceeding any further, I think in order for us to understand fully the Arab Revolution and its relationship with Palestine, we must note the political importance that the solidarity to the Palestinian people has played. In an article submitted to a comrade, Hassan al-Hamwali, he relates precisely. He says, the Egyptian revolution, rather than coming out of the blue on the 25th of January 2011, is a result of a process that's been brewing over the previous decades, a chain reaction in autumn 2000 protests, which in solidarity with the Palestinian Intifada. Those demonstrations broke the silence on the streets, and although these protests were pro-Palestinian in nature, they slowly began to ignite an anti-regime sentiment as the state responded with force. And the first time that we heard an anti-Mubarak slogan, this was chanted at a pro-Palestinian demonstration in 2002. And the anti-war demonstrations that were shown in solidarity with Iraq in 2003 also were pro-Palestinian. At face value, you might be asking yourself, Palestine doesn't seem to hold a central issue to the revolution, but I think this is wrong. You know, the Palestine remains a symbol of the former colonial order and blatantly displayed the double standards of Western hypocrisy. In Tunisia, in Syria, in Libya, and so on, slogans for Palestine were being chanted and the Palestinian flags were being presented. I really wanted to talk about a really incredible event that happened last year on the 15th of May, which marks Nakba Day, the day that the Palestinians were kicked out of their homes in 1948. There was a coordinated march which was arranged from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and they all decided to march to the borders of Israel. And of course, those in West Bank, in Gaza, and the Palestinian Israel were marching as well. There's lots of talk of Israel, you know, being in a hostile region, but on this day, the Arab Revolution knocked on the doors of Israel. This broke the illusion that Israel can live comfortably like a villa in the jungle. In Egypt, the protesters were stopped from reaching the Rafah by the army. In Jordan, the protesters were beaten up by the police before they reached the border. But this was a nightmare scenario for Israel because it actually made them see that the refugees were marching towards Israel and exercising their right to return. I mean, the most successful was seen when hundreds of youth marched from the border and then they were able to cross and visit people in Masjid Shams, a village in the border. And one of the most exciting stories for me was one guy who was able to reach Tel Aviv and visit his grandparents. You know, this wouldn't have happened without the Arab Revolution. The revolution brought inspirational to these acts. Another important example, I think, is in a statement that we see in Tahrir Square by the Federation of Independent Trade Unions. They wrote a really long statement, but the really most inspirational was when they said, the independent unions completely reject any forms of normal relation with the Zionist enemy, as they reject all forms of cooperation with any person or organization who's involved in normalization or is calling for normalization. We affirm our complete support to the right of the Palestinian people to create an independent state in the whole of Palestine and the right to use any means of resistance to achieve their rights. Like I said, the Palestinian liberation was really at the heart of the Arab Revolution. But the Arab Revolution really did inspire the Palestinians, and it ignited a wave of political activity, and it gave them confidence. Immediately, with the beginning of the uprising, we saw people take to the streets in Palestine and express their solidarity with their Arab brethren. These uprisings, I believe, served Palestinian youth in much way the same that the solidarity protests served the Arab activists. They were an avenue where people could show solidarity, but there were also places where people could channel their frustrations with their government. These protests were obviously repressed heavily both in West Bank and Gaza. But some of the same activists in Palestine who helped mobilize these solidarity campaign led the charge for their own protest against much more local matters. This led to the development of the 15th of March movement. A wave of protest, the largest Palestine has seen in a very long time, wasn't even directed at Israel. They were directed towards the two main political parties, Fatah and Hamas, and they focused on demanding unity. The most famous slogan from the Arab Spring that we heard in first in Tunisia was actually being echoed in Palestine, Al-Shahab Yarab Iskat al-Mazid, which means the people want to bring down the regime. This movement was named after the day people had arranged a march in the streets of West Bank and Gaza. It literally grew from the Middle Eastern Revolution. We saw many formation of independent networks, mostly youth, but also supported and joined by the old guard activists. We saw the continuation of this movement in the daily demonstration in front of Israeli jails during the historic mass hunger strike in April. The anger towards the Palestinian Authority was very strong. Even Abbas was chased out of one of the solidarity tents with the striking prisoners by their family members. These continuing demos and actions of solidarity managed to reposition the issue of Palestinian prisoners onto the political agenda, and it completely crushed the image of the Palestinian Authority supporting the Palestinian people. I think these demonstrations are significant, and they shed a light on the changing of the political mood in Palestine. The Palestinian leadership recognizes, and many argue that Abbas pressured the political prisoners to stop their hunger strike in exchange for weapons from Israel. During the hunger strike, Abbas was reported telling the New York Times, "I cannot control the situation. I am afraid, God forbid, that these security systems here would collapse." This was obviously followed by one of the biggest anti-Palestine authority war criminal to Ramallah. Just to put this into context, Mofaz commanded the Israeli army from July 1998 to July 2002, and he was then the defense minister. Mofaz can't come into London without being immediately arrested, but somehow Abbas thought it would be smart to invite him to go to Ramallah. On the 30th of June, a day before Mofaz was scheduled to visit Ramallah, people took to the streets, and this time it was not mainly youth. The protest was joined by people from different age groups, political factions, and so on. And